Good afternoon. Welcome to Bugbee and Conkle's webinar on the Department of Labor's new overtime rules. My name is Dana Quick. I'm an attorney here with Bugbee and Conkle. Just so everybody's aware, I have muted everybody's line except for my own so that everyone can hear me clearly. I would ask that you do not unmute your lines because that will cause some feedback and people will not be able to hear. If you have questions, there is a chat box where you can type them in, and I'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm from Toledo. I went to the University of Toledo for law school. After that, I went down to Miami, Florida, where the weather is beautiful and extremely hot, and I clerked for a bankruptcy judge down there for a couple years, and then went into private practice doing commercial bankruptcy and other insolvency matters. 2 years ago, I came back to Toledo and joined the law firm of Bugbee and Conkle, where I do labor and employment law and commercial litigation. And we're going to jump right in here. I'm going to start the presentation by going over a little bit of the current overtime regulations. I think those are important to understand in order to put context around the new rules. And then we will talk about the new rules, what they are, what they mean, and what you should do next to comply. And then, like I said, we'll open it up for questions. So first off, we're going to look at the rules as they are today. And these are rules that everyone should already be complying with, and so there shouldn't be any surprises here, but you never know. There are two basic tests that the Department of Labor employs to determine whether an individual employee is exempt from overtime pay and can be paid on a salary basis for work performed over 40 hours. Primary duties and salary basis. The primary duty test looks at the individual's duties, and they pull out the main, major, or most important parts of their duties, and if they fall into one of these 5 categories, then their duties are sufficient to pass this test. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these categories so you have an understanding of what kinds of positions might meet these requirements. The first one is executive. The primary duty of an executive should be managing the business or managing a department or subdivision. Their primary duty should include interviewing and selecting employees, setting or adjusting their rates of pay, apportioning their work and planning for work of employees in the organization or in the area that they manage, and looking out for the safety and security of the employees. An executive employee also needs to regularly and customarily direct the work of at least 2 full-time employees or the equivalent of 2 full-time employees. They should also have the authority to hire and fire or make recommendations about hiring and firing and have their recommendations given significant weight. That's the executive. A professional is somebody whose primary duty includes work that requires advanced knowledge. Their work should also include consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. And when we talk about advanced knowledge, this is going to be mostly college level work. It's a field of science or learning that requires prolonged intellectual instruction. It could be a bachelor's degree or it could be a higher degree. Some of the fields that are included here would be law, medicine, engineering, architecture, teaching, the kinds of positions that we would typically think of as professional, but the key here is that they need to require a prolonged course of intellectual study. So what we're excluding here are people who maybe took lesser classes or some kind of a certificate program. They would not be included in the professional category. It might also include creative individuals, people whose primary duty includes invention, imagination, something artistic or creative. They should also, though, have gone through a prolonged course of specialized instruction to perform these jobs. Next on the list is the administrative positions. And these are people whose primary duties need to be in the non-manual work of the company that's primarily directed at the management of the company. These are going to be people who are in human resources, potentially personnel management, marketing. They may have a degree, they may not require a degree, but they should exercise discretion and independent judgment, just like the executive and professional. This is one of the key themes between these three areas, that and the performance of non-manual labor, that really separates them from the hourly employee. The last two categories, computer worker and outside sales, have some special rules related to the payment of these workers. The executive, professional, and administrative should all be paid on a salary basis, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The computer worker and outside sales are a little bit different in that area, but they do have primary duties that are important. A computer worker is somebody whose primary duties include systems analysis or design and development of computer or machine programs, maybe documentation, or a combination of these duties. It used to be that pretty much anybody who worked on a computer at all, whether it be word processing or some other kinds of function, were thought to qualify under computer worker. This was before courts were really aware of what computer worker meant and what kinds of things qualified as design, development, or analysis of computer programs. Courts are now more in tune with what these kinds of positions are, and they're people that you would typically find in a IT department or in a company that focuses on IT development. The last category is outside sales. And this is separate from a regular sales position because the individual employed needs to be regularly outside of the office. They need to be out in the field, talking with customers and making sales or taking contracts for services. The position of outside sales cannot be fulfilled by doing web-based sales or telephone sales or mail sales. It has to be in person out of the office. So this is probably not something that a lot of companies would use, but it is available. The second test that we want to look at when we're talking about overtime regulations is a salary basis test. Currently, all of the positions that we discussed, with the exception of computer worker and outside sales, need to be paid on a salary of at least $455 per week or $20,660 per year. And the salary basis is in addition to the primary duties. So you need to have both of these in order to have an overtime exempt employee who's paid on a salary basis. There is one exception that we should talk about here, and that is the highly compensated employee exception. And this applies to people who are paid more than $100,000 per year. And the Department of Labor has said, if you're going to pay somebody this amount of money, we're going to gloss over some of the primary duties. In fact, you don't need to have any primary duties. You just need to have one function that exists in one of the categories of executive, professional, or administrative. So if you, as an employer, want to pay somebody $100,000 or more per year, the Department of Labor is not going to give you much grief on what they're doing. And they'll agree for the most part that these are salaried employees. So now let's look at how the new rules change some of these definitions. And for the moment, we're going to skip over the highly compensated employees, but we'll come back to that. The new rules are really only changing the salary amounts on the salary basis. These will go into effect on December 1, 2016, and they'll require that for a salaried employee, the minimum amount they can be paid on a salary basis is $913 per week, or $47,476 per year. Now, if you look at a calendar, December 1 falls in the middle of a work week, so in theory, most employers are going to start putting these into practice the week before. You might want to take a look at your calendar and see how your payroll calendar and see how it relates to the December 1 starting date. Oh, let's go back for just a second. These numbers are based upon a certain formula that the Department of Labor contrived. They looked at salaries all across the United States and determined which census area of the U.S. was the lowest paid. And then they took the 40th percentile of earnings in that region and pegged that as the minimum amounts for this new salary test. One of the other things the new regulations do is they provide for a update of the salary amounts every 3 years. And so in 2020, when the next round of updates occur, it could be that the South is no longer the lowest paid area, and a new region is chosen as the lowest paid area, and the 40th percentile of that region will become the new starting amounts for these salaries. And I would also suggest that the increases in 2020, when they come out, will probably be significant because they will include the 3 years that we've had with the new higher wages under these new FLSA rules. So before we go any further, let's talk about the highly compensated individual. This amount is also changing. It's going to go from $100,000 to $134,000. And if you're willing to pay an employee that amount of money, the Department of Labor is not going to question pretty much what they do. The new regulations do have, they do allow for up to 10% of the quote-unquote salary to not be salary, but instead be comprised of non-discretionary bonuses, incentive payments, or commissions. These need to be paid at least quarterly. And so if you're paying at least 10% in these non-discretionary bonuses, it does reduce the amount that you would need to pay on a weekly basis to about $821 per week. However, I would caution you that relying on these bonuses could get you into trouble if, in fact, the non-discretionary bonuses do not make up the difference between the $913 per week and the $821 that you're paying. You would also need to look at the impact that these bonuses would have on people who leave before the end of a bonus period or who begin and end their work in the middle of a bonus period, because they would still be entitled to those bonuses. And as I said, all of these amounts will be updated automatically every 3 years based upon whatever the current salary amounts are. And there's no prorating any of these amounts for part-time white-collar employees. So if, for example, you have a part-time professional employee in your human resources department who is maybe working half-time, you cannot simply say, well, we'll pay you half of the $913 per week as salary. That's not allowed. You either need to pay them hourly, or if you're going to pay them salary, it has to be at least $913 per week, regardless of how many hours they're working. So what this means is that some of the employees that you currently have classified as overtime exempt employees who are paid on a salary basis will no longer meet the criteria to be overtime exempt. That means it's probably going to cost you some additional money, either an additional salary or when you convert these employees to an hourly basis. You'll also need to reevaluate where your salary amounts fall each time these amounts are revised every 3 years. And for those of you who are choosing to include bonuses in these amounts, you'll need to reevaluate whether or not you're meeting the salary requirements on probably a quarterly basis, and make sure that you're paying at least $913 per week to these overtime exempt employees. And you'll want to do this because failure to comply will result in very costly lawsuits and fines. The dollar amounts add up quickly, especially when you have multiple people working in the same category who could all potentially bring lawsuits. So as employers, what you need to do is to take a good hard look at all of your salaried employee positions. You'll want to look not only at the salary basis test, but also at the primary duties test. For some employers, you probably haven't reevaluated whether or not your overtime exempt positions really are overtime exempt, whether they meet the current interpretation of the primary duties test. So this is something that you'll definitely want to take a look at. And there's a couple ways that you can handle these situations. You can choose to increase the salary level to meet the new minimums. You can adjust duties so that positions which previously required some amount of hours over 40 no longer do. You can split a position into 2 or more positions. Perhaps both of them are part-time. Or you can convert these employees into an hourly minimum wage, an hourly wage. And when you do this, you'll want to take a look internally about how this impacts their benefits, whether that is healthcare or other kinds of benefits that you offer to your employees, especially those who are going from a full-time position to a part-time position or a salary to an hourly. And something else you should really look at is not only the work that these employees are providing within the workplace, but also the work done outside. This could be your employee who spends 40 hours a week in the office, but then takes home 5 to 10 hours of work to do on the weekend from their home computer. Another big area of enforcement right now with the Department of Labor is work done remotely on phones. We now have 24/7 access to emails, and in some cases, employees and employers don't know how to turn that off when they leave the office. So if you have an employee who has access to work emails outside of the office that perhaps you're converting into an hourly position, you'll want to come up with ways on how to handle that. And it could be a simple matter of revoking access to emails or instructing employees not to respond to workplace emails outside of the office. The Department of Labor is not going to come down on most employers if the emails and other kinds of communications are incidental and only occur rarely. However, if it's a regular practice, then definitely it's something that you need to address with non-salaried employees. And this is outside of simply these new Department of Labor regulations. It's become an area of enforcement for the Department of Labor recently, for good reason. So you want to take a look at all of these, and you have until December 1st to really start to really implement whatever it is that you're going to do. But those discussions probably need to start now about how to reshuffle these positions or address what might be a shortfall in their salary at this come December 1. So let's take a hypothetical. This is Anne. She is happy in her Human Resources Department job. She has a salary of approximately $40,000 a year, and she is anticipated to have weekly hours of about 45. Anne meets our primary duties test, and as of today, she meets the salary basis test. However, come December 1, while she still meets the primary duty test, she no longer meets the salary basis test because she falls short of the $47,000 and change that's required under the rule. So what we could do with Ann, we could increase her salary, which I don't think Ann would complain about. The minimum salary would need to be $47,476. That would be $913 a week. We could take some of Ann's duties and reassign them to somebody else, thereby reducing her hours from 45 to 40 each week. And if we're going to convert Ann into an hourly position, we need to figure out how many hours it is we think that she's going to work. If she's going to keep all of her duties, and we expect her to work 45 hours per week, we can retain an average salary of $40,000 per year if she's paid $16.19 per hour. And this takes into account the 5 hours of overtime we anticipate, although we will have to pay overtime for any hours above and beyond that she works over 40 as well. So some weeks she may work 47 and make a little bit more, and some weeks she may work 40 and make a little bit less. But if she averages 45 hours per week, this would keep her at the $40,000 salary level. If we wanted to cut out some of Ann's perhaps administrative tasks and reduce her hours to 40, if we paid her $19.23 per hour, that would keep her at approximately $40,000 per year, although we would have to pay her additional amounts for any overtime that's incurred. So this is an example of how you can evaluate each of these positions. Definitely take a look at the primary duties test, even though that isn't changing with these new regulations, only the salary basis. But if you can strip away some of those duties that don't fall under the primary duties test from these positions, you may find that 40 hours is sufficient to meet all of their objectives. At this time, I'm going to take some questions, and I'm going to start with a question that was sent in advance of the webinar. This question is specific to the healthcare industry, and I didn't discuss it here because it's a very industry-specific exception, but there is a temporary waiver for providers of Medicaid-funded services to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that waiver applies to facilities, residential facilities with 15 beds or fewer. And it says that they do not have to meet these minimum salary thresholds until 2019. And the question from this person asked if the rule only applied to residential facilities with a total amount of beds, 15 or fewer, or if it would apply agency-wide if you had multiple residential units with 15 beds or fewer in each facility. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know because this question was not answered in any of the guidance provided by the Department of Labor. This waiver is tied to a concern raised by the Department of Health and Human Services, especially for these residential home-based care providers, and because they are also working to comply with another regulation passed down by the Department of Health and Human Services. And the concern is that if they were required to meet these minimum salary amounts, there would be an insufficient amount of care for these at-risk individuals. The regulation itself doesn't give any indication about whether it would apply to an entire agency that has multiple residential units. I would think that answer would be no. I think that this is very limited in scope to very small organizations that have a total of 15 beds or fewer. However, in addition to providing a waiver, the Department of Labor is also providing technological assistance to these organizations that may qualify. So if you think that your organization may qualify for this waiver, I would urge you to contact the Department of Labor directly and pose this question to them because it is not answered in any of the literature that's out there. And while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I wanted to let you know that we are having our firm's semi-annual seminar. This one will focus on labor and employment issues, and I'll be speaking more in depth about some of the differences between employees and contractors, which is another related area where employers can get caught up in a mess. Well, I don't see any questions on the screen. If you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in. If not, I thank you all very much for your attendance.